Welcome back, everyone. Hope you all had a refreshing break. We're so excited to start our State of GBV session and to share with all of you what we've been doing at SOAR, as well as pass it off um, to the incredible Dr. Swathi Reddy from API-GBV afterwards to give us a walkthrough of how to tell stories with data. So just to give you a quick breakdown, so we're going to start off this session with a quick SOAR introduction for about roughly 30 minutes, and then we'll pass it off for some comments and questions, and then to Dr. Swathi to take us through her presentation, and then until the hour, we'll go to another break. So with our rough session agenda out of the way, I'm going to quickly refer to people to check out our chat question and to share in the chat kind of what's one piece of data that would be important to collect in the South Asian GBV field that you feel you haven't seen. So with that introduction out of the way, I'm going to quickly pass it to Yasmin and Amrita to kick us off and engage in the chat.
Thank you, Sagar. So as Sagar said, welcome to our presentation on the state of GBV. We actually did this presentation last year, and we're bringing it back with some new data and new information. But we just wanted to kick it off with this question, which is, as Sagar said, what's one piece of data that would be important to collect? It could also be something you've seen and want to collect more of, or go deeper on. Veda, that is such an important one. So much more research and data collection is needed on that, on South Asian LGBTQIA plus survivors. I'd love to get, and Camilla, I'm seeing you're saying data specific to states. That's current. I feel like that is like the key word there. So much of what we refer to is also from like 2002, and we're just like, that's not cutting it. Yes, Kritika, info on what mental health means. Yasmin, feel free to respond to anything jumping out to you also.
I was gonna say, I feel like it's sometimes hard to come up with an answer. I mean, I created this question with Amrita, so I'm sorry if you're like, I can't answer this question. And I feel like it's even hard for me to answer this when I don't even know like what's available, like what possibilities there are and like what we collect. So sometimes like it's helpful for me to be like, okay, wait, beyond that, like in my wildest dreams, like what would I want to see published? So we want you all to like dream big on like what you would want to see out in the world.
More segmentation, yes. Meaningful language access, yes. Okay, I'm seeing so many. Keep them coming. And this is a lot of kind of what we'll also come back to at the end of this session is a similar question. But for now, I'll get started. So to bring us into our reimagining theme, we're really trying to live into that this summit. As I mentioned in the beginning, it's important for us to understand the present. Yasmin, you also kind of just spoke to this, right? Like it's hard to think about what we need next if we don't really know what do we even have now. And I think what we've done as a collective over the past few years is begin to understand that present. I think each of you represents like the expert, the deeply grounded, knowledgeable individuals and teams in your specific neighborhoods, your communities, even your state. And what we're able to do together is sort of say, okay, well, where does that match up at the national level? And that's what a lot of these materials on the right are here. So our State of the Field report, which we released in October of 2023, preceded by our Together We Rise report in October 2022. In case, I know we have a lot of new members joining us today, in case you're unfamiliar with either of these pieces of work, Sagar is dropping the links to all of them in the chat. And I really highly encourage you to check them out. We've specifically linked the executive summary because I know sometimes a 100-page report can be daunting, but we got you with that cheat sheet. And then Thirdly, we've also started to release a body of work around reproductive justice, namely our community briefing. There are several more to this. We have different fact sheets. I think Sagar will link our page on statistics, but here's a sampling of what we've been able to do together. Now, we kind of just also started talking about this, like, why is it so important to collect our own information? I think research studies do an incredible job of telling us like what prevalence looks like, what different factors are, but it doesn't always tell our stories. And so in 2022 and 2023, SOAR set out to start to fill some of that gap. We did that the best way we know how, which is coming to all of you through listening sessions, surveys, sometimes multiple surveys. Shout out to Himadri for all of the reminders for each of those surveys. And most importantly, or as importantly, shout out to all of you for completing those surveys and supporting us with that data collection. I want to start off with our State of the Field report, because that's what we just released and we'll be focusing on more of today. So in case you weren't around, our State of the Field survey, I think it went out in March or spring of 2022, and it took us about a year to analyze, finally collect all of the data on, and then share back with you. It gives us a kind of overview of everything from client volume and demographics to programs and services, the impact of COVID-19, and then some more things like funding. Quick shout out to Noreen Islam, who is the Deputy Director at SEPNA NYC, one of our member organizations, who has done the beautiful art for the State of the Field cover and report, which you'll see through the slides. If you want to go to the next one. I want to name this, and we named it last year, which is we do our best, and I know you all do your best too, to be a part of this data collection effort. But it is so challenging nonetheless because of all of the differences in how we collect data, how we define terms, and just data doesn't always let us get to the nuance and complexity inherent in our work. So I just want to name that up front as we go through these, and I'll try to point out limitations as we go as well. So we're going to start with the basics, which is all about client and call volume. You can go to the next slide. Before I fully get into that, I wanted to sort of illustrate the picture of who are South Asian gender-based violence organizations. I know even though we're in the movement, sometimes it's hard to look out and know who else is there. And I also know SOAR gives us the space to do that. But this particularly tells us kind of when organizations were founded. So we can see a lot of organizations founded in 1984 to 1994, but we've continued to see that movement growth. And in our report, you can see we share a little bit more about like what we're seeing. We're seeing more specialized organizations about particular ethnic communities, particular religions, and helping us to sort of understand like where does our movement need to go or grow. But getting into the client and call volume, the first stat I just wanted to share is the number of survivors served by South Asian GBV organizations. So the sample size or the size of organizations that completed this survey is about half of our membership. It's about 26 organizations. So these numbers aren't even fully comprehensive of all of us. What I think is particularly fascinating in this slide is how the number of clients doubled between 2020 and 2021. And I know even when we collected data on trends for 2023, that client volume has continued to increase. Of course, I think something that everyone has on their mind looking at these 2 years in particular is the impact of COVID on an increase in violence and kind of how that both decreased and then increased client volume. I also think this number is particularly kind of astounding, which is in 2021, there were 43,000 requests for help. At the end of our slides, which we will share, we actually have 2 appendix notes on how we define call volume and client volume. Call volume or helpline requests and then client volume. It is different organization to organization. We did our best to sort of define and standardize that to come to these numbers. But now let's dig deeper into who you are serving. So the first thing we wanted to note is that almost 50% of South Asian survivors or survivors served by South Asian GBV orgs are unemployed or underemployed. This connects obviously to our conversations about financial security this morning, but also our commitment around economic justice and the services that you all provide. On the right half, we have a finding around citizenship status and immigration status of South Asian survivors. And I think it wasn't surprise anyone to know that over half of the survivors that you all serve are not US citizens. And in the report, you can actually find the broken down statistics of each of these groups. So how many green card holders we have, how many undocumented survivors are served, and more. Another couple of important things to know, and I'm going to get to why this all matters in just a second. Predominantly, South Asian GBV organizations serve women and heterosexual survivors, potentially suggesting the underrepresentation of LGBTQIA+ and male survivors, which respectively are 17% and 4% of the total survivors served. I want to bring this back to the point Veda said in the chat about who we need to learn a little bit more about. It's really hard to know who is being served, how are they being reached, what are our gaps in services without understanding the prevalence of violence. I think the most researched group is women experiencing domestic violence in a marriage, but there is so much more about who experiences violence and how it's experienced in our diaspora that is left to be discovered and discussed, and we're going to be getting into that in some of our presentations today. And then on the right, South Asian survivors report experiencing over 15 different forms of gender-based violence, including family violence, sexual assault, immigration-related abuse, and more. I know this is super important for all of you, as maybe mainstream organizations or funders are asking you the differences in violence that our community experiences compared to maybe others. And I think the breadth and types of violence experienced here are pretty critical to name and understand. But if you can go to the next slide, why does this matter? I started to speak to this a little bit, but these help us understand where we may need additional services, resources, training, and partnerships. So that is honestly why we have our Serving Underrepresented Survivors session today. We've prioritized it and made it part of our programming and summit for the year. It's something that from the very early days of SOAR, you all have requested and named as a need. And same thing to the second point, it also prompts reflection for us on where representation of marginalized groups are needed in our organizations, in our research, in our storytelling, and even our movement language. Even something like shifting from women to survivors and acknowledging that survivorship is experienced across all genders. I'm going to go through the next slides at a slightly more high level. And again, I encourage you to check out the report because it really dives into more of these at much more depth than I will. But we'll go into now the services that you're providing. Super high level, your organizations are providing over 50 different forms of support in up to 20 South Asian languages. Also so important, I think, for funders or mainstream organizations to understand just the breadth of your work. And it also helps us understand and connects back to conversations around urgency and sustainability. We are doing so many things and trying to meet so many needs at once. And I know, Navneet, you had a note on language access, which I'd love to lift up as well. But you can go to the next slide for now. And finally, budgets and funding. I think two critical things we wanted to bring up are government grants are the primary source of funding for organizations. Again, connecting this back to conversations around sustainability, funding. This stat really jumped out to us and helped underscore the need for increased investment from private foundations and individual donors. But it goes way beyond that. What are the other limitations that come from government funding being our #1 source of funding? Who else do we need to call into the movement to support this? what ways do we need to shift how the movement is funded to not be so restricted and limiting, both around sustaining our people, but also sustaining and growing programs that are really by us and for us. And finally, I'm sort of doing a dual like sharing of data plus also sharing about our salary benefits and budget survey. So this is the only piece of data from a different survey than our state of the field. And we actually had to, just in the vein of transparency, had to try to do this survey twice. And so in 2022, we first attempted to collect salary benefits and budget data, and we had to redo that data collection in 2023. We just also wanted to update those numbers and improve the way that we were asking some of those questions. So one of the key findings from this survey was that our organizational budgets range from 280,000 to over 7 million. And I think like in some ways, I mean, and I know that the lower end of the budgets isn't even representative of our current members today. This is from our 2023 survey where only half of our members were a part of the survey. But something that I think is kind of beautiful in looking at this range is actually how much we can support each other. I know so many questions have come up about how do I just get to that point where I can actually sustain a ED in a full-time role, where we can hire staff, where we can, you know, not all of us be doing everything. And I think that's just like a one like beautiful sort of thing that I wanted to highlight about what this community can bring for each other or hold for each other. But what I also obviously think is super important is how underfunded our organizations are and how underfunded our work is. And that was the driving force around the salary benefits and budget data. So I'll be sharing a little bit more about our next steps here. But for now, I want to take us into our most recent trends, which I think are quite fascinating. So in 2023, we collectively served over 13,000 survivors across 33 organizations. This is from the data that you all submitted in your registration forms. So again, that's 33 organizations out of our 43 member organizations. So it doesn't fully capture the amount of or the number of survivors that you all serve, but I think it gives us a good understanding of collectively how many survivors we serve. On the right, we see a couple of key trends. So across the board, of course, an increased need for services, specifically a demand for legal services. I think I wanted to particularly point out an increase in complex cases, including high-risk cases, transnational abandonment, and femicide. There was also a lot of trends shared around resource challenges, specifically lack of shelter space and funding instability. If you go to the next slide, I have just a few more trends. These also connect to what were shared in the chat. So there was a growing need for mental health support, but also for family and children support. And this is going to connect a lot to what Yasmin is going to share. There was also a lot shared around intersectionality and how what your organizations are doing and seeing connects to gun violence, hate crimes, Islamophobia, and other forms of gender-based violence. And then lastly, a need for prevention. There was both a lot of mentions of new work around engaging with men and education around healthy relationships, but also a desire for more of that work to happen, which I think we would all relate to. I'm actually going to skip this slide for the sake of time, Yasmin, and go on to our next steps, which I'll kind of like cover what was on the previous slide. We actually have a simplified guide to help you use this report to advocate for your organizations. And we also have a feedback form to gather your feedback on this. We would love to keep improving how we collect data. And that brings me to my last point, which is that we've gotten the question of how often do we plan to collect this national data? And I think SOAR is still assessing that, both based on our capacity, but also all of your capacity and your interest in maybe shifting towards some more standardized data collection or just the ability to take on the work required for national data collection. And finally, the next steps on our salaries, benefits, and budget survey. SOAR has been convening executive director forums since the last fall. to really think through this data, the narrative and the analysis. So you'll note that I don't have a timeline on here, and I think that's like all just in our pure like honesty. We want to share this as soon as we can, and we're doing our best to just make sure that the data is actually valuable to all of you and anyone that we might be sharing it with. And I think that's the end of my section. So I'm just going to pause for 1 second, see if there's any questions or observations coming up for you. I know a lot of resources were dropped in the chat. And so, yeah, you're welcome to check those out and always reach out to us with questions. Yasmin, I feel like you can get started and we can see. Oh, sorry, Veda, go ahead.
That's okay. I could also share in the chat if we're short on time. Is that better?
That would be awesome. And we'll also have another pause point for questions. Thank you, Veda. Oh, I'm so sorry. I totally forgot our exciting news. How could I forget? So of course, as you know, I've been talking about all the work that SOAR has released, our bodies of research. And even as I look at the data that I just shared, I think something that always jumps out to me that has been missing is kind of the heart behind that data and behind those key findings. And so the exciting news that we wanted to share today is that we're actually gearing up to release our first storytelling anthology of South Asian survivor stories. If you want to go to the next slide, Yasmin. Our storytelling anthology really seeks to uplift these key findings with stories. I think that is the way that we can shift hearts and minds. We can deepen an understanding of what actually our challenges are for both survivors and organizations and advocates. So in the interest of time, I would love for you to check out the links in the chat, but just wanted to note we're hosting both an anthology and an academy. The Storytelling Academy is a space for you to actually work on those stories and be supported through them. And you can learn more about both of those in the interest form that Sagar has linked. And I'm also just going to drop my email because I'm always available to answer questions or chat more about either of these. And with that, I'll pass it to Yasmin.
Awesome. Thank you for walking us through such valuable research, Amrita. And I know I was like, oh, what about the storytelling anthology? But I'm glad that we still have it on the slide. I was like really excited for it because I think it's an awesome opportunity to work with our membership and just the broader community, invite them into this space and really like bolster our research with storytelling. I think that's such a powerful form of art making and also just making our research come to life. So along with those publications, we'll also continue our Their Light Remains series in 2024. And I want to just take some time to share some findings from this past year and share some next steps in this area of research. So at a high level, in 2023, we actually saw double the number of known lives lost compared to 2022. And this in itself was incredibly troubling for our community. And as we further examined each case and told their stories, more patterns began to emerge. So I'm going to share our analysis with you all, but just as a quick content warning, these statistics carry just like so much weight, especially for the survivors in this field and for those of you who work, especially as advocates. So if at any point you need to step away or take a break, you're more than welcome to. You're always welcome to like come back and rejoin our space. So in 2023, 10 of the 11 homicide cases that we were found that were known in public involved the death of an immigrant woman. And this finding is likely not surprising to many of you in the room who are familiar with the high rates of violence immigrant women in our diaspora experience. One study found that the South Asian Americans, immigrants that are surveyed in the US, 57% of them were female participants reported experiencing physical abuse, 42% reported experiencing economic abuse, and 29% reported experiencing immigration-related abuse. But we lack more disaggregated data that studies the violence immigrant women in our community face, which is why we're working together as a membership to collect data for reports like TWR, like SOTF, because it's so important to continue raising awareness on both the forms of harm that occurs in our community and the number of clients your organization serves that are navigating systems as non-citizens, which looks so different for folks who are looking for things like U visas, where legislation and policies that we don't really have control over really affect them. 6 of the 11 homicide cases that we examined also involved gun violence. So national research shows that guns, and I think we all know this, undoubtedly compound the likelihood of fatal violence. One publication found that cis male harm doers are 5 times more likely to kill their partner if they have access to a gun. And another publication found that nearly 2/3 of all intimate partner violence cases, or IPV homicides, involved gun violence. The presence of a gun just escalates these moments of crisis and has led to so many lives lost. But despite the vast amount of research and advocacy our field, and I know all of you in this room have done for this, the issue of gun violence is still on the Supreme Court's table, which is just so frustrating. And they're answering the question right now of whether or not people subject to protective orders should be allowed to possess a firearm. And the lower court actually ruled that restricting the possession of a firearm for those folks violates the Second Amendment. So this one ruling struck down 3 decades of a federal ban and effectively lets people under protective orders pass background checks that were meant to be gun violence regulations that would have prevented violence in the states. But this one court's order just effectively eliminated that. But this court case that's on SCOTUS's lap, U.S. v. Sahimi, is still ongoing and has very real and measurable consequences that we may see as we continue to track fatalities in our community. But about 60 domestic violence organizations across the country in 2023 actually filed an amicus brief asking SCOTUS to reverse the lower court's decision. And notably, this brief features stories of survivors. That's actually like the vast majority of the brief. And I think that really underscores the importance of storytelling, like I said, to bringing data to life. And we hope to do the same thing with our storytelling anthology this year. Another 6 of the 11 cases were murder-suicides and claimed the lives of 17 people total. All of the cases that we examined involved a male harm doer, and of those 11 men, 10 were South Asian and 10 were husbands or fathers of the people who lost their lives. These findings, I think, stress the urgency for research, cultural shifts, and just community interventions to support men and harm doers towards ending those cycles of violence. And it also raises the question of how we address family violence as a distinct form of GBV, like Amrita had said earlier, like working with children and finding programming for them. And that brings me to my next point, that another 6 of the 11 cases unfortunately involved a youth fatality. So of the 17 lives lost this year, 7 were children. 6 of those 7 were actually killed alongside their mother, their sibling, or their entire family. So for more reading on family violence in Asian communities, we highly recommend the API-GBV's 2010 report. It breaks down the types of GBV homicides and the effect on and roles of different family members in instances of GBV in the Asian community. But I think we all know that the impact of IPV doesn't stop at one partner. Researchers actually penned the term corollary victims, and that means children who are harmed by IPV cases but are uninvolved in the IPV itself. So one US-based study that examined firearm homicides of children precipitated by IPV from 2003 to 2020 found that over half of the IPV-related firearm homicides of child corollary victims included the homicide of the adult intimate partner, of which 94% were the child victim's mother. And that same study also found that child firearm homicides had greater odds of involving IPV when co-occurring with the harm doer's suicide. So we see both those statistics from national research reflected in our smaller sample of South Asian American GBV cases from both 2022 and 2023. And just the heartbreaking loss of youth, I think, just really highlights the pervasiveness of IPV and family violence in our community. It truly leads to the unimaginable, which is the erasure of entire families. So if you'd like to read the full analysis, you can check out the letter to the community on our website for 2022 and 2023's Their Light Remains series. We also have a zine on our website with prompts for reflection that we're going to be collecting submissions for until the end of March. And we'll republish the zine with everyone's musing so that we can learn from each other's brief rituals and experiences. And that might just be a good way to decompress after reading the analysis, because it is really, really heavy. And unfortunately, in 2024, we've learned of even more GBV cases, 2 more cases that actually claimed the lives of 8 people, 5 of whom were children, and 1 of whom was a harm doer. And in both of these cases, the husband or father caused the harm by using a gun. The spike of violence at the end of 2023 and the beginning of this year really motivated us to think about how we tell the stories and collect the data on these cases in the most impactful way for our communities to raise awareness and to advocate for survivors. So we came up with a series of next steps that we're inviting members to be a part of. So firstly, we're working with Adishri Nayak, a SOAR fellow who's getting her MPH and MSW right now, to bolster our data collection and research. Along with staff, she helped create a fatalities tracker, which I'll show in just a moment, and we'll link it in the session resources. But secondly, we wanted to invite our organization members to filling out a rapid response strategy survey. So that link will be dropped in the chat. And the information from this survey will be used to build out a rapid response toolkit, which Amrita will share more on later. Third, we really encourage anyone who's interested in publishing an op-ed, either as like an individual or an organization, to reach out to Amrita. I think op-eds are like a really great opportunity to raise awareness, whether it's like your local paper or a national paper, just generally getting the community to start having conversations about these fatalities, because I think many of them just don't even know this is happening in our community. And lastly, we invite our individual members to join our Their Light Remains pod, where we'll work with Adishri on her research and prepare for our annual Digital Remembrance campaign at the end of 2024. Here's a screenshot of the fatalities tracker that Adishri was able to backfill with cases from 2022 to 2024. And in this tracker, we're analyzing violence factors such as gun violence, a documented history of GBV, like if there was an order of protection. And we're also analyzing other ways to track trends in the data. So we encourage everyone to take a peek at this. If you feel like there's a category missing, please reach out to us. We're happy to expand our research and look more into different violence factors. We're also categorizing all murder suicides and youth fatalities as family violence to mark it as a distinct form of GBV. And along the same lines of being intentional with our language, we're exploring using new terminology in our tracker and our analysis. So you might have noticed like throughout this presentation, we use terms such as harm doer because we do really reject the idea of an abuser victim binary, but it's quite easy to follow it. You'll notice like in our letters, we still do use those terms. I think law enforcement uses those terms, researchers use those terms, but I think it's important for our field, especially for working for like the liberation of survivors and the understanding of like why people cause harm in our movement, to think about other ways to grapple with these identities and understand that it's not one or the other. And we want to be able to dive into those complexities. And the final part of our tracker that you do is examine policies related to violence factors, such as like legislation or the court cases like US versus Rahimi, to just like underscore the urgency of these issues and what actions we need to take now to further survivor justice. So I know that was like a lot of information and a lot of heavy information. I'm just curious to know like what's coming up for you all, if you had any thoughts or observations as I was presenting that data. And then also we'd love to know what further research and analysis is important for your work and your advocacy as like an individual or an organization. So I'll give you all a few minutes to maybe like think about it. You can drop your answer in the chat or we can have a conversation out loud, but I'd love to hear your thoughts on these questions. Yeah, thank you, Hannah. I appreciate you raising that actually about grants in particular. Does anyone have any thoughts on, or maybe feedback from like what you've seen grants want to hear from, or what kind of need you've been trying to articulate, especially from like data like this, which I know is sometimes harder to communicate and also just has like a smaller sample size, so it can be tricky to write grants for. Yeah, go ahead, Sir Roger.
Hi everyone. So some of the pieces that I'm thinking about is like the importance of like language and storytelling in shifting cultures and narratives, and especially with the op-ed, the narrative building that was mentioned. It reminded me of this newspaper article that I was reading a few years back. In Bengali, it's a local like Jackson Heights like newspaper published, and it was like reporting on a survivor, but like I knew the story from like Facebook from the survivor's friends, but the newspaper reporting was like completely different. Like it was kind of, it had like all the marks of like victim blaming and essentially like, yeah, it was just a different narrative altogether. Like it wasn't the story of the survivor. And it kind of like and also like recently, like last year, right, when there were so many cases in the broader New York area, and I went to like a healing circle, and people were sharing about, and this was in a Pakistani community, and people were sharing about like what their parents were like telling them about the homicide, and it was like a different narrative, you know, like the parents were, and trigger warning, the parents, like one of the folks' parents said that, oh, like she wasn't a good wife, so like what else she should have expected, like, so like, you know, like these are the conversations I feel like we are having, like conversations that are very different from sometimes the conversation happening on the ground in communities, like at dinner tables. Um, and I think like local newspapers and local like spaces where conversations take place, like at a cha spot or whatever, like those are where I feel like we need to like break in, and because there's so much like normalization um like happens around violence in those spaces, and it's absolutely heartbreaking.
I really appreciate you sharing that, Suraj. I mean, you're absolutely right. Like it looks really different when we don't tell our own community stories. And even when sometimes we are telling our own community stories, it's from a perspective that can be really harmful. Like we perpetuate these harms that we like grow up with, especially if it's from a role of someone who maybe was like complicit in the oppression or was fine with the oppression of the other person. So I really appreciate you saying that, especially like the building around narrative change. Nothing do you want to share as well?
Yeah, first of all, I was going to say thank you so much. I think this is such an important conversation and presentation. I just wanted to respond to a comment by Hannah, I think, in the chat about grants. Absolutely. And at Manavi, we actually were, because of presenting data for, I think our specific goal was legal services and how a lot of survivors, South Asian survivors, don't have access to legal representation. We collected data over the years, and we really submitted a very strong grant application to OVW for an in-house attorney. The grant was a lab grant. And in our almost, well, I guess 38 years, 39 now, years of Manavi, we had never had an attorney. Because of that data, we got accepted and we were able to get like a 600,000 grant. And because of that, we have an in-house attorney. We had an in-house attorney. That's huge. But imagine how long. It shouldn't take that long, right? It shouldn't take this long for. So my main point here is that data is critical for writing grants. And the more focused we can be. Similarly, we now have a housing navigator we've never had before because of data. And we showed that so many South Asian survivors are falling through the cracks and they don't have access to housing and they are being homeless. And because of that, now we have a specific position called housing navigator at Manavi. So I'm all about, I think this is so critical for applying to grants, federal grants, state grants, local grants, all of them.
I really appreciate you naming that, and congratulations on having those positions because they are so important. And I also understand like the capacity of organizations is so different. Like it can be so hard to have that data collection, to do it in a way that's easy to communicate to funders. Even the conversation of like how do we standardize data across the movement is so tricky when we use different platforms. We have different measures, different definitions of like, even like Amrita said, like client volume and like client calls. So it's interesting to have these conversations, and I really appreciate that advice and that insight from you all. Aparna, do you have a thought as well?
I have lots of thoughts, but thank you so much for putting the data, in a place to where we can access it. And my concerns are always that the numbers might be even higher, and we're just not getting the information. Like one of the New Jersey cases, I don't think it came to light until there were issues regarding the child. Right. So I wonder, even in the South, like I hear stories, but then I don't know what's actually being counted and actually being listed as a domestic violence homicide or fatality or murder suicide. And so I think that's one of my concerns, is that it's not being documented. It's so well hidden in our community that the numbers could be way higher than what's out there. So I just, putting that out there and thinking about that, but also just thinking about, like, I think there was a comment earlier when we talked about reimagining and saying, okay, taking on less cases or less serving less people. And it scares the daylights out of me when I see how the numbers of folks, the number of folks who are dying at the hands of domestic violence. So just hoping that we can find a balance when we have these conversations about reimagining the future, because I already feel like the survivors in our community have limited resources. And in some states, you might have one, if not, you know, any, right? One resource. So you can't really, it's just that hard balancing act. I'm all about us taking care of each other, but also making sure that the services are available to survivors. And I really think we need to think about that a little bit too, because there's just too much bad stuff happening. And we have a lot of both community work and direct services work to do to change the climate that allows this to happen.
Yeah, I completely feel that. I feel like there's like this movement contradiction that even came up in like the keynote today. Like there's so much need and like want for prevention work, and then there's also like so much demand, and it feels like we need to like split our attention between the two, and that we can't do both at the same time. And I feel like that's like the scarcity that we've been put into like by the government, by carceral systems, where like they will only like fund one side of it. They're not looking for that prevention side as much, and they're not looking for, I feel like that there maybe is more movement now towards culturally specific resources and like culturally specific organizations, but there is such a need for more abundance and like more funding and investment from our own community into what we do. So underscoring that urgency, I think, is really important, and moving beyond the scarcity that like we've been put into as a movement. And Amrita, how are we doing on time? I'm so sorry. I think I'm
We're
missing
a little
something.
behind. So I hate to cut this conversation short. I was telling Yasmin, I was like, you should just present the whole time and we should talk about this, but next time. And we'll definitely be creating more space. For now, I'm going to pass it to Sagar to kick us off into our next presentation. We have a couple of next steps, but we're just going to put them in the chat, and they are in the handbook. So